Welcome to the American Red Cross's presentation of Even War Has Rules, an introduction to international humanitarian law. Our presentation will last about 1.5 hours. We hope you find it enlightening. International humanitarian law, or IHL, is a central part of the Red Cross mission. Wars and conflicts are a reality in today's world, and while humanity has not yet found a way to end them altogether, we can reduce their destructiveness. That's what IHL seeks to do. Set rules to limit suffering and protect people during war. Both the Geneva Conventions themselves and the statutes of the International Red Cross movement instruct the American Red Cross to teach international humanitarian law, sometimes called the laws of war, to citizens throughout the United States. That is why we are here today. There are about 200 sovereign states in the world. The possibility of war between sovereign states always exists. Today we see ongoing wars between states as well as many dozens of conflicts within states. In every war, people are killed and injured, communities are displaced, buildings and infrastructure are destroyed, and the environment is damaged. International humanitarian law steps in here. It doesn't stop the wars, but it tries to lessen their devastating effects. A current example of a war between states is the war between Russia and the Ukraine. IHL governs how prisoners of war should be treated and prohibits targeting civilian populations. Despite violations, the framework of IHL provides a language for accountability and a hope for justice after the guns fall silent. The ongoing and devastating civil war in the Sudan is an example of a war within states. International humanitarian law applies to such internal conflicts as well. In wars, people are hurt and killed. Buildings and farms are destroyed. Roads and factories are damaged, and the natural environment suffers. Populations are displaced, and many are imprisoned. These terrible things happen to people who find themselves in war zones every day. Sadly, nearly half of the deaths directly caused in armed conflict today are innocent civilians, rather than those fighting in the conflict. Why, we might ask, do we even need rules for war? The answer is that without limits, wars would be even more destructive. International rules, often in the form of treaties, make certain behaviors illegal, and courts can determine if those rules have been violated. While enforcement is sometimes limited, the very existence of these rules sets important standards for humanity in wartime. The primary reason given for having rules for war is to reduce the suffering caused by war. Some seeing limiting the violence, particularly with respect to the civilian population, as contributing to the conditions where peace can be restored. On the other hand, some cynical voices would say that having rules for war makes certain killing and destruction legal and thus authorized by society. It allows soldiers to kill one another without calling it murder. The rules of war can be divided into two broad categories. The first is jus ad bellum, which refers to the legality of going to war in the first place. This body of law asks, when is it lawful for a state to resort to armed conflict? It covers questions like self-defense, UN Security Council authorization, and prohibitions on aggression. The second category is jus in bello, or international humanitarian law. Jus in bello applies once a conflict has begun and regulates how war is fought. A practical example is the 2003 Iraq War. There was intense debate over jus ad bellum, whether the invasion was legally justified under international law. But regardless of that debate, jus in bello still applied. Coalition forces and Iraqi fighters alike were bound by the Geneva Conventions and prohibited from targeting civilians or mistreating prisoners of war. Treaties between sovereign states make compliance with the rules of war legally binding. These agreements establish obligations, empower courts and tribunals to investigate violations, and sometimes allow for penalties. Even though international enforcement is limited, treaties provide a framework that shapes behavior. The Geneva Conventions are the most widely accepted treaties in history, ratified by nearly every country. This near universality means that when violations occur, states and humanitarian organizations can appeal to a shared legal and moral standard. If many states follow some custom or rule for many years, and if they do so on almost all occasions, and if states do not openly object to the rule, then a custom can become international law, if states view that following this custom is obligatory. Much of international humanitarian law is both treaty law and customary law. As an example of a custom that became law, consider the practice of ships traveling with a red light on their port, left side, and a green light on their starboard, right side. This started as merely a custom in the 1800s, but is now part of international maritime law, binding on all states in the world. States are less inclined to ratify binding treaties than they once were. New international humanitarian law will increasingly be built via customary rules becoming laws. International humanitarian law, or IHL, is the body of law that regulates armed conflict. It protects people who are not or no longer participating in hostilities, and it restricts the means and methods of warfare to prevent unnecessary suffering. These laws have traditionally been viewed as two separate bodies of law: laws that govern how people are treated, the Geneva Conventions, and laws that govern how war is conducted, the Hague Treaties, and now the additional protocols. IHL applies in both international wars and many internal conflicts. For example, rules on humane treatment apply whether someone is a prisoner of war in a conflict between states or a detainee in a civil war. This breadth makes IHL relevant in nearly all armed conflicts today. A turning point for international humanitarian law came in 1859 at the Battle of Solferino in Italy. After witnessing more than 30,000 soldiers wounded and dying, Henri Dunant, a Swiss businessman, stopped everything to help. His experience inspired the creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1863, an organization devoted to assisting the victims of armed conflict. Dunant's story reminds us of the power of individual action. He had no army, no government backing, and no plan, only compassion. Yet his efforts led to the creation of a global humanitarian movement. Today, Red Cross volunteers carry that same spirit into conflicts from Syria to Sudan, proving that one person's response to suffering can ripple into history. In the United States, Clara Barton played a similar role. During the Civil War, she cared for soldiers and advocated for more humane medical treatment. After the war, she met with the International Red Cross in Europe. In 1881, thanks to her leadership, the American Red Cross was founded, with a mission to bring relief and protection in times of war and disaster. Barton became known as the Angel of the Battlefield because she brought medical care directly to the front lines. Her insistence that even the wounded deserve dignity reshaped American attitudes toward wartime medical care, and her legacy still defines Red Cross missions today. The Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is built on 7 fundamental principles. These principles ensure impartiality, neutrality, and independence, so that humanitarian work can reach those in need, no matter the side they are on. In practice, this means that Red Cross workers can operate in conflict zones where few others are trusted. For example, in Yemen, Red Crescent teams have delivered aid across battle lines precisely because all sides recognize their neutrality. The Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is structured into 3 components: the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, and the 191 national societies. Together, they form one unified movement bound by common principles. The International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent works to uphold international humanitarian law and bear witness to the behaviors of parties involved in armed conflicts. The International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent works to coordinate disaster relief work of the national societies in responding to humanitarian disasters around the world. This unique structure allows local societies to respond to national emergencies while drawing strength and legitimacy from a global humanitarian movement. During the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln became concerned that Union armies were applying different rules for the treatment of prisoners, civilians, and fugitive slaves. To address this, he asked his Chief of Staff, Henry Halleck, to find someone capable of creating a clear code of conduct for Union forces in the field. Halleck turned to the scholar Francis Lieber. Lieber had experienced war firsthand. As a young Prussian soldier during the Waterloo campaign, he was wounded, abandoned, robbed, and left for dead on the battlefield. He survived, but the brutality of war shaped him for the rest of his life. In 1863, Lieber authored a code of nearly 200 rules governing how Union soldiers were to fight and how they were to treat civilians and prisoners. Known as the Lieber Code, it was the first comprehensive attempt to place humanitarian limits on warfare and later influenced international treaties written in The Hague. The ideas first captured in the Lieber Code did not end with the Civil War. They evolved over time into the Geneva Conventions, which today form the core legal protections for wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilians in armed conflict. The Geneva Convention of 1864 was the first international treaty to protect wounded soldiers on the battlefield. It required armies to care for the wounded regardless of nationality and established the Red Cross emblem as a protective sign. The treaty was originally signed by 12 nations, but this number quickly expanded to include most of the nations on the earth. At the urging of Clara Barton and the American Red Cross, the United States signed the treaty in 1882. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 expanded the rules of war into 18 separate treaties. Partly based on the Lieber Code established by Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War, the treaties codified centuries of customary law and addressed weapons, the treatment of prisoners, and the responsibilities of occupying powers. A famous Hague rule is the prohibition of dum-dum bullets, designed to expand on impact and cause unnecessary suffering. That ban, created in 1899, still applies today, demonstrating how old agreements remain relevant in regulating modern warfare. World War II exposed just how inadequate existing laws were. Over 45 million civilians died, alongside more than 20 million soldiers and 5 million prisoners of war. The scale of suffering highlighted the urgent need for stronger, clearer protections under international law. The Holocaust, the bombing of civilian cities, and the mistreatment of prisoners all underscored the absence of enforceable protections. These tragedies directly inspired the drafting of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, proving that law often advances only after deep human loss. The First Geneva Convention protects the wounded and sick of armed forces on the battlefield, along with the medical personnel and facilities that care for them. It requires humane treatment without distinction and recognition of protective emblems. This means that a medic wearing a Red Cross armband or an ambulance marked with the emblem should never be attacked. Violating this rule endangers humanitarian responders everywhere and undermines the ability to save lives. The Second Geneva Convention extends protections to the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea. It requires that they be collected and cared for, and it shields hospital ships and coastal rescue craft. For example, during naval conflicts, a marked hospital ship cannot be lawfully attacked. This ensures that even in the chaos of maritime warfare, humanitarian obligations are respected. The Third Geneva Convention governs the treatment of prisoners of war. It requires humane treatment, protection from violence, and access to due process. Prisoners must be housed, fed, and allowed correspondence with their families. Access to POW camps by the International Committee of the Red Cross is one of the most visible aspects of this convention. It ensures that even captured combatants retain dignity and basic rights. The Fourth Geneva Convention protects civilians, especially under military occupation. It prohibits collective punishment, ensures essential services, and safeguards hospitals, schools, and religious sites. This convention is especially relevant today in conflicts where military occupation of civilian areas occurs. Its rules prohibit forced population transfers and the settlement of the occupier's citizens in occupied territory, issues that remain at the heart of international disputes. Additional Protocol 1 strengthens protections in international armed conflicts. It reinforces the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. It also expands safeguards for civilians and the natural environment, and clarifies obligations to verify targets and avoid unnecessary harm. This protocol updates and incorporates much of the treaty law established in The Hague at the start of the 20th century. For example, the protocol requires that when launching an attack, commanders must choose methods that minimize incidental civilian damage. This means selecting smaller, more precise munitions, or timing attacks to avoid crowded areas, obligations that make the principles of EWHR more concrete in practice. Additional Protocol 2 was groundbreaking because it applied humanitarian law to non-international armed conflicts, such as civil wars. It established minimum protections for persons not participating in hostilities, including prohibitions on violence to life, cruel treatment, and hostage-taking. This protocol came about in part because of conflicts like the Spanish Civil War and later Vietnam, which revealed the need for rules even when wars were fought within states. Today, it is central to addressing humanitarian crises in places like Syria, Myanmar, and Sudan. Additional Protocol 3 codifies the use of the red crystal as a protective emblem, alongside the Red Cross and Red Crescent. The red crystal was created as a neutral, non-religious, and non-political symbol to ensure protection in all contexts. Although it is not currently used by Iran, the red lion and sun emblem from Iran remain an official emblem of the Red Cross movement. The Rome Statute, adopted in 1998, established the International Criminal Court. This permanent court has jurisdiction to prosecute individuals, not states, for the most serious crimes under international law: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and, with later amendments, the crime of aggression. The ICC represents a major step in holding individuals accountable, even leaders, for violations of international humanitarian law. The creation of the ICC was a milestone in international justice. For example, Thomas Lubanga of the Democratic Republic of Congo was the first person convicted by the ICC, found guilty of conscripting child soldiers. Cases like his show how the court can give voice to victims and signal that such crimes will not go unpunished. Despite having over 100 signatories around the world, a group of very powerful nations do not recognize the jurisdiction of this court over its citizens. The original Geneva Conventions were designed to be enforced by nations against their own citizens, rather than having a supranational body preside over all people. The crimes under ICC jurisdiction are genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Each of these categories reflects the gravest offenses against humanity. Genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Crimes against humanity include widespread or systematic attacks on civilians. War crimes are serious violations of the laws of war. The crime of aggression involves the use of armed force by one state against another in violation of the UN Charter. The trials of leaders such as Slobodan Milosevic and Charles Taylor, though some were under other tribunals, illustrate the principle behind the ICC, that even the highest-ranking officials can be held accountable for crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. These prosecutions send a message that impunity is no longer acceptable. There are 4 fundamental principles of international humanitarian law governing how wars should be fought. These principles were derived from centuries of customary international law. They were first codified by Francis Lieber in the Lieber Code of 1863, and then incorporated into the many Hague Treaties and Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. We will spend some time with each of these principles and see the important role they play in limiting the devastation caused by war. The principle of military necessity allows only those measures that are required to achieve a legitimate military objective. It does not justify unlimited force, and it never overrides other rules of international humanitarian law. Necessity is about striking what is militarily relevant, not destroying for destruction's sake. For example, a commander may lawfully target an enemy ammunition depot, but necessity does not permit destroying a village that has no military value. This principle ensures that force is tied directly to legitimate objectives, not convenience or revenge.
A common misconception about armed conflict is anything goes when engaged in combat. This is simply not true. The 4 fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, or IHL, military necessity, limiting unnecessary suffering, proportionality, and distinction, work together as interdependent and reinforcing parts of a single system. Military necessity justifies a certain level of lawful violence as necessary to defeat the enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible. Conversely, the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering forbids causing suffering that is unnecessary to achieve a military objective. The principle of proportionality requires that even when actions may be justified by military necessity, The expected harm caused to civilians by those actions must not be excessive when compared against the expected gain by conducting the actions. Finally, the principle of distinction requires armed forces to distinguish between the enemy forces and the civilian population and only conduct attacks against the enemy forces. Collectively, these fundamental principles both recognize that violence is a natural part of armed conflict while working to minimize its devastating impact on both soldiers and civilians. The principle of military necessity allows parties to an armed conflict to use those measures not forbidden by international law, which are indispensable for securing the complete submission of the enemy as soon as possible. Put another way, military necessity recognizes violence will be necessary to bring about the end of an armed conflict as quickly as possible, but maintains certain weapons and tactics are so bad they will not be allowed. Let's take a moment to look at this definition in depth. Military necessity has 4 elements. First, violence and destruction in war is allowed. This means that the killing, injuring, and capturing of people and destruction of property is permissible. Of course, the definition doesn't stop here, or conflict would still be as brutal as it was in the Middle Ages. There are 3 more elements that also must be met for military necessity. The second element is that the measures used are indispensable to secure the complete submission of the enemy. This element of the definition requires that the acts of violence and destruction being done are indispensable, or, put another way, necessary to the military operation. It also allows for overwhelming force to be used against an enemy and recognizes that total and unconditional surrender of the enemy is a permissible goal. The third element is, as soon as possible. This element recognizes that the longer an armed conflict lasts, the more devastating it is on the parties fighting it, and to the civilians that are affected by it. The fourth element is where humanity comes into play and is the heart and soul of the military necessity definition. It provides that acts or measures cannot be used if they are forbidden elsewhere in international law. While the first element says anything goes, it is the fourth element that says, not so fast, other parts of law must still be followed. While the first element of the definition is permissive, it is the last element that restricts. Together, they allow any means or method of warfare to be used unless that mean or method is specifically forbidden by another part of international law. To understand this principle in action, consider this example. A bridge in country A allows civilians to cross a river that divides their town. Normally, there would be no military necessity for destroying the bridge because it serves no military purpose and destroying it would not help win the conflict. However, this can change if the bridge is used for a military purpose. To illustrate this, let's change the example a little. Now there is an armed conflict ongoing between country A and country B. The army of country A is on one side of the town, and the army of country B is on the other side of the town, with the river and bridge separating them. Country A's army plans to attack country B's army by crossing the bridge. The bridge has now changed from having purely a civilian use to also having a military use. Country B can now destroy the bridge without violating the principle of military necessity, because destroying the bridge will create a military advantage for Country B by stopping Country A's attack. It is important to note, however, that before the attack on the bridge can take place, the other 3 fundamental principles of IHL must also be met. While the principle of military necessity does justify violence and destruction in armed conflicts, it does not allow armed forces to doing whatever it takes to win. Military necessity never justifies violations of other provisions of IHL. Produced by the American Red Cross. If you have any questions, please contact ihlaw@redcross.org.
The principle of limiting unnecessary suffering prohibits weapons and tactics that cause harm beyond what is needed to achieve military objectives. It aims to prevent superfluous injury and suffering. This principle is central to the American Red Cross framing of IHL. For instance, blinding laser weapons and expanding bullets are banned because they cause suffering that far exceeds any military advantage. Modern debates about landmines and cluster munitions continue to test the boundaries of this principle.
A main idea of international humanitarian law, IHL, is that the means and methods of warfare are not unlimited. In fact, one of the 4 fundamental principles of IHL is to limit unnecessary suffering. Limiting unnecessary suffering is the IHL principle that forbids the infliction of suffering, injury, or destruction beyond what is necessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose. The 4 fundamental principles of IHL, military necessity, limiting unnecessary suffering, proportionality, and distinction, work together as interdependent and reinforcing parts of a single system. Although the principle of military necessity justifies some suffering as necessary to defeat the enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible, military necessity cannot justify causing suffering that is not necessary to achieve that purpose. To do so will legitimize cruelty and wanton violence. For this reason, the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering is often thought of as the counterbalance to the principle of military necessity. On one hand, military necessity allows violence in armed conflict, while on the other hand, limiting unnecessary suffering places a limit on how violence can be inflicted. The first international agreement addressing the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering was the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration. In 1863, Russia developed a bullet which exploded on contact with hard surfaces. Its intended use was to blow up wooden ammunition wagons. By 1867, the bullet was modified so that it would explode on contact with softer surfaces, including the human body. Concerned that using a bullet against people would cause unnecessary suffering, the Russian government decided not to use the bullet. They also did not want other countries to use it either. Their answer was the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration. This international agreement prohibited the use of exploding bullets because they caused greater suffering than was necessary to achieve a legitimate military goal. The modern definition of the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering is found in the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Article 35 of Additional Protocol 1 addresses the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering by stating, "It is prohibited to employ weapons, projectiles, and material and methods of warfare of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering." Put another way, weapons and tactics which are designed to create more suffering than is necessary to achieve a legitimate military objective will violate the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering. Additionally, once a military objective has been achieved, causing more suffering is unnecessary and must be avoided. The most common way nations ensure they follow the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering is to train their armed forces to cause no more suffering and destruction than is required by their mission. A more systematic approach is to conduct reviews of new weapons before allowing them on the battlefield. Additional Protocol 1 requires nations to study each new weapon to ensure the harm caused by the weapon does not result in unnecessary suffering or violate other provisions of IHL. Once a weapon has been approved and it's used in an approved manner, it should not violate the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering. While the principle of military necessity recognizes that suffering and destruction are necessary in armed conflict, the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering puts a limit on how much suffering is allowed. Suffering to achieve legitimate military objectives is unfortunate but necessary. Causing suffering that is not necessary to achieve a military objective is cruel and is prohibited. Produced by the American Red Cross. If you have any questions, please contact ihlaw@redcross.org.
The principle of distinction requires parties to a conflict to distinguish at all times between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. Attacks may only be directed at combatants and military targets, never at civilians or protected facilities. In urban warfare, this principle is especially difficult, but also critical. Target verification, precision strikes, and the marking of protected sites like hospitals are all applications of distinction. Failing to make this distinction has led to some of the gravest tragedies in modern warfare. Civilians are protected under IHL and may not be targeted. They lose this protection only if, and for as long as, they directly participate in hostilities, for example, by taking up arms or assisting in combat operations. In many conflicts, civilians often live alongside fighters in urban areas. This makes their protection more difficult, but the principle remains. Attacks cannot be directed at civilians, even if the military advantage would be significant. On the battlefield, not everyone has the same status. International humanitarian law classifies people into categories such as civilians, combatants, medical and religious personnel, and others. These classifications determine their rights, protections, and whether they may be lawfully targeted. Likewise, international humanitarian law classifies object or places into different categories, such as military objective, civilian objects, cultural and religious sites. Military objectives can be targets, but other objects should not be targeted unless they are utilized for a military purpose.
Not everyone and everything on the battlefield can be targeted during an armed conflict. The principle of distinction, one of the four fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, IHL, requires the parties to an armed conflict to distinguish between civilians and combatants. and between military objectives and civilian objects. Military objectives and combatants can be deliberately targeted. Civilians and civilian objects can never be deliberately targeted. While the fundamental principle of distinction is not specifically written into the four 1949 Geneva Conventions, it was included in the 1977 Additional Protocol 1, which supplements the four main conventions. Additional Protocol 1 addresses distinction in two places. In Article 44, it says, "In order to promote the protection of the civilian population from the effects of hostilities, combatants are obliged to distinguish themselves from the civilian population while they are engaged in an attack or in a military operation preparatory to an attack." It is also addressed in Article 48, where it says, "In order to ensure respect for and protection of the civilian population and civilian objects, the parties to the conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives, and accordingly shall direct their operations only against military objectives." These two articles taken together create the modern IHL principle of distinction, which has two aspects. The first requires combatants to distinguish themselves from the civilians by taking steps to separate themselves from the civilian population. This is typically done by requiring the armed forces to wear uniforms or display a distinctive emblem that is visible from a distance so that the enemy will not confuse the combatants with the civilian population. Additionally, they should not locate military objectives, for example, radar stations and anti-aircraft guns, close to civilian objects. Placing military objectives close to civilian objects forces the enemy to choose between attacking a military object and harming civilians, or refraining from attack to safeguard civilians. The second aspect of distinction requires that before conducting an attack, parties must distinguish between combatants and civilian objects and military objectives. They must take all reasonable steps to ensure the weapons and tactics they use in the attack are directed only at combatants and military objectives. Some types of landmines are simply placed in the ground and left to be triggered by whomever steps on it. This type of landmine is a good example of a weapon that violates the principle of distinction, because it is by its nature indiscriminate. Whoever triggers the mine causes it to explode regardless of whether the person is a civilian or a combatant. When the mine is buried, there is no way to target it directly to combatants, and no way to tell if it will ultimately harm a combatant or civilian. IHO recognizes that civilians and their objects cannot be completely spared from the violence and destruction that is always part of armed conflict. However, it does seek to limit the effects of armed conflict on civilians. The principle of distinction, along with the other three fundamental principles, are how IHL attempts to protect the victims of armed conflict. Produced by the American Red Cross. If you have any questions, please contact ihlaw@redcross.org.
Proportionality is one of the more difficult principles of international humanitarian law. It accepts the fact that civilians will be injured and killed during war, and accepts the fact that an attacking forces may even know that civilians will be killed during a planned attack. It is not illegal that civilians are killed. Rather, it is illegal if a military attack causes excessive, unnecessary civilian casualties. The principle of proportionality prohibits attacks if the expected civilian harm would be excessive compared to the direct and concrete military advantage anticipated. It is a balancing test. Even lawful targets cannot be attacked if the cost to civilians is too high. For example, destroying a small weapons cache is not justified if it would also demolish a crowded apartment block next door. Proportionality forces militaries to constantly weigh military gain against human cost and to seek alternatives that reduce harm.
Similar to the other fundamental principles of IHL, the principle of proportionality imposes restrictions on what actions can be taken during armed conflict. The principle of proportionality requires that before an attack can occur, a military commander must weigh the anticipated harm to civilians and civilian objects against the anticipated military advantage to be gained. If the anticipated harm to civilians and damage to civilian objects would be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage of the attack, then the attack should not be conducted. The principle of proportionality is not new. Like the other three fundamental principles consisting of military necessity, distinction, and unnecessary suffering, the principle of proportionality in armed conflict has existed in various forms across world history. In the 17th century, the famed international lawyer, Hugo Grotius, attempted to expand the definition of proportionality by writing, "One must take care, so far as is possible, to prevent the death of innocent persons, even by accident." In 1863, Professor Francis Lieber wrote about the importance of taking precautionary measures before attacking in his code for the Union Army during the American Civil War. Commanders should, whenever admissible, inform the enemy of their intention to bombard a place, so non-combatants, and especially the women and children, may be removed before the bombardment commences. Proportionality continued to appear in various forms in armed conflict throughout the 19th and 20th century. The principle of proportionality, as understood today, was written in its final form in 1977 as part of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Article 51 of Additional Protocol 1 states, "An attack should not be conducted if it may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated." There are 4 important things to note from this definition. First, proportionality only considers the impact the attack will have on civilians and civilian objects. The impact on combatants or military objectives is not considered. Second, the anticipated loss of civilian lives, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects is not evenly balanced against the anticipated military advantage to be gained from the attack. It is not even enough that the anticipated harm to civilians outweighs the anticipated gain to the military. The principle of proportionality requires that the anticipated loss to civilians must not be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage that may be gained by the attack. The principle of proportionality does not make it illegal to cause civilian casualties. Instead, proportionality focuses on whether an attack creates excessive civilian casualties and damage to civilian objects. Third, the proportionality calculation is not a precise measurement. The commander ordering the attack must use his best judgment to weigh the anticipated civilian casualties against the anticipated military advantage. It is left to the judgment of the attacking commander to decide when the loss to civilians is excessive. Fourth, to determine if the principle of proportionality was properly followed, it is reviewed using the standard of what a reasonable commander would have done under similar circumstances known at the time the decision to attack was made. It is important to remember that the commander's decision is reviewed based on the information that was reasonably available at the time of the decision. After an attack is conducted, it may be discovered that the actual loss of civilian lives and property was much greater than what was anticipated, or that the military advantage actually gained by the attack was much less than what was anticipated. While it may be human nature to judge the proportionality of an attack based on the perfect information that is available after an attack has been conducted, this would be unfair to the commander ordering the attack, as he must make his proportionality determination based only on the information that was reasonably available to him before the attack is conducted. To better understand how the principle of proportionality works, consider this example. A commander in the Army of Country A learns that 3 senior commanders from the Army of Country B will be meeting in a room in an apartment building. The commander from Country A believes that if he bombs the building, he will kill all 3 of the senior commanders from Country B. But he also anticipates he will kill 20 to 30 civilian residents and destroy the apartment building. In deciding whether to bomb the building, the attacking commander from Country A must ask himself if the anticipated loss of 20 to 30 civilians and an apartment building is excessive compared to the anticipated military benefit he would get by killing the 3 senior commanders. This example highlights one of the most difficult aspects of the principle of proportionality, the fact that there often isn't a clear right or wrong answer. The facts in the example can be adjusted to create more clear-cut answers, but proportionality is always a judgment call of the attacking commander. For example, if we change the facts to say there was one very junior enemy soldier hiding in the apartment building and bombing the soldier would cause the deaths of 20 to 30 civilians and the loss of the apartment building, almost everyone would agree that the attack is not proportional and should not be conducted. Likewise, if we said that every senior leader in Country B's army was attending the meeting in the apartment building, and by killing them, the war would end immediately, likely saving thousands of lives, many would say that attack would be worth the loss of the civilians and apartment building. While these last 2 examples provide more clear outcomes, most applications of proportionality in real situations are not clear. Let's take a look at a real example of proportionality from World War II. In February 1945, U.S. forces were fighting in the Philippines to enter the heavily defended capital city of Manila. Subordinates of the U.S. commander, General Douglas MacArthur, repeatedly requested permission to use airplanes to bomb enemy positions in the city. General MacArthur refused, saying, "You would probably kill off the Japanese all right, but there are several thousand Filipino civilians in there who would be killed too. The world would hold up its hands in horror if we did anything like that." MacArthur decided not to conduct the air attack because he believed the loss of civilian lives by doing so would be excessive to what he believed he would gain by the attack. Military commanders engaged in armed conflict must make life and death decisions every day, often with imperfect and incomplete information. Their decisions not only impact the lives of their soldiers, but also the lives of the civilians in the area where they fight. IHL cannot completely protect civilians from the impacts of armed conflict, but by applying fundamental principles such as principal proportionality, it can work to inject humanity into it. Produced by the American Red Cross. If you have any questions, please contact ihlaw@redcross.org.
Weapon choice has a direct impact on proportionality. A large bomb with a wide blast radius can cause much greater civilian harm than a smaller, more precise weapon. International humanitarian law requires commanders to consider these effects and to use weapons that minimize unnecessary suffering and collateral damage. For example, in counterinsurgency operations, militaries often rely on precision-guided munitions rather than unguided bombs. By selecting a smaller yield weapon, such as a Hellfire missile instead of a 2,000-pound bomb, they can neutralize a target while reducing unintended civilian casualties. Many militaries, including the United States and its allies, use formal collateral damage estimation methodologies to assess the risk to civilians before approving strikes. These systems require commanders to analyze the target, the weapon, and the environment to predict potential civilian harm. When followed, these processes ensure that commanders are given relevant information about the potential for civilian casualties in an attack before that attack occurs. Such methodologies might flag that striking a target at midday when a marketplace is crowded poses unacceptable risks, whereas conducting the strike at night may greatly reduce civilian casualties. These tools don't replace human judgment, but they guide commanders toward more responsible choices. At certain times in history, the only people who would be on a battlefield would be the combatants, fighting for one side or another in an armed conflict. In modern wars, there are many different categories of people found on a battlefield. In the next few slides, we will discuss various categories of people and how the rules governing their treatment vary. First, on the battlefield, it is only the combatants that can be targeted and killed by enemy combatants. It is only the combatants that are legally permitted to target and kill their enemy. Second, and most importantly, we must understand that all people, under all circumstances, regardless of the category they fall under, must be protected from harm and treated with dignity when they are not participating in hostilities. That is an ever-present rule in international humanitarian law. Civilians are the people who find themselves in war zones and who are not participating in an armed conflict. They are the innocent bystanders to armed conflict. Unfortunately, nearly half of the casualties in today's wars are civilians. When Henri Dunant and Clara Barton experienced war, only about 5% of the casualties in war were civilians. Military forces operating in the vicinity of civilian populations have a responsibility to protect these civilians from harm, both during fighting and during periods of military occupation. Combatants are members of the armed forces of a party to the conflict. They are lawful targets while fighting, but if captured, they are entitled to prisoner of war status and protections under the Third Geneva Convention. During the Gulf War, thousands of captured Iraqi soldiers were granted POW status and visited by the Red Cross. This demonstrates how even enemies in wartime retain legal rights and protections. Medical and religious personnel are given special protection under IHL because of their humanitarian roles. They must not be attacked and are expected to display protective emblems, such as the Red Cross, when feasible. An attack on a marked field hospital or a chaplain is a grave violation of IHL. Conversely, misuse of emblems, such as disguising soldiers as medical staff, undermines trust and is itself unlawful. Civilians who directly take part in hostilities lose their protection against attack, but only for the duration of their participation. Once they disengage, they regain civilian protection. For example, if a civilian fires on soldiers during a battle, they can be lawfully targeted while fighting, but once they put down their weapon and return to civilian life, they cannot be attacked simply for what they did earlier. Unprivileged combatants, sometimes called unlawful combatants, do not have the right to fight and do not qualify for prisoner of war status if captured. However, they are still entitled to fundamental humanitarian protections. This category became widely discussed after 9/11 in the context of Guantanamo Bay detainees. However, even when their status is disputed, IHL requires humane treatment and prohibits torture or cruel treatment. During armed conflicts, certain civilians accompany armed forces onto the battlefield. Examples include journalists, supply contractors, and maintenance crews. While they retain civilian status, they should be issued identification designating their role and be treated as prisoners of war if captured by enemy forces. International humanitarian law protects civilian objects such as homes, schools, hospitals, and cultural sites. These places cannot be targeted unless they are being used for military purposes, such as storing weapons or housing troops. For example, a school being used as a base for launching attacks could lose its protection and become a lawful target. But if it is functioning as a school, attacking it would be a serious violation of IHL. This distinction highlights the importance of accurate intelligence before strikes are carried out. IHL also prohibits widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. Such destruction can constitute a war crime under Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. A stark example comes from the Gulf War in 1991, when retreating forces set fire to hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells. The smoke, pollution, and environmental devastation lasted for years. Under modern IHL, deliberate acts of environmental destruction are not just tragedies but crimes, prosecutable on the international stage. Dr. Albert Schweitzer once said, "The Red Cross is a light in the darkness. It is the duty of all of us to see that it does not go out." These words capture the essence of international humanitarian law. Even in the midst of violence, destruction, and despair, IHL represents a beacon of humanity, a reminder that compassion and dignity must endure. That light shines every time aid convoys reach besieged cities, when medics treat the wounded under the Red Cross emblem, and when courts hold perpetrators of war crimes accountable. The survival of IHL depends on our collective responsibility to uphold it, ensuring that even in the darkest moments of war, humanity does not disappear. What started as the vision of people like Henri Dunant and Clara Barton to ease the suffering of the sick and wounded on the battlefields of the 19th century has grown into the largest humanitarian relief organization in the world. The American Red Cross serves the people of the United States every day in every corner of our country.
5 things you need to know about the rules of war. Civilians must be protected. It is illegal to target civilians and civilian objects, things like homes, schools, and hospitals. The sick and wounded must be cared for, regardless of whose side they're on, like soldiers, the shipwrecked, civilians, and medical staff. Detainees are also protected under international humanitarian law. This includes protection from acts of violence and intimidation, and special protection is given to prisoners of war. All those who've died must be treated with dignity. Under international humanitarian law, warring parties must facilitate the return of the dead to their loved ones. Humanitarian aid, like food, water, and medicine, must be able to reach people. So parties to a conflict must facilitate humanitarian access. And most importantly, the rules of war must be applied without discrimination, regardless of a person's race, sex, nationality, political opinion, or religion.